Is this one on? Okay, cool. Well, good evening. My name is Daniel James. I'm going to be, I guess, your host through this evening. I'll be speaking with Larissa soon, but I thought I'd start off with an acknowledgement of the country. The elder we had booked tonight can't make it because NAIDOC week is an insane week for elders in capital cities like this, and so I'm sure by Friday evening it's well and truly done and dusted for a lot of people. So I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I recognise that where we're standing now always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you very much for coming along this evening. It's good to be out, yeah? And what a beautiful room. No woos yet, it's too early for the woos. Look, welcome all to the State Library of Victoria for this joint event between the Wheeler Centre and the State Library of Victoria. I'm glad you've made it all tonight. It's going to be, hopefully, a fascinating night of poetry, conversation and music with our esteemed guests, Susie Anderson, Larissa Behrendt, who will be joining us like our overlord soon, and the wonderful Kian, who will be performing for us later. I think it's really important to acknowledge that NAIDOC week is a really important week for mob in particular, and so I would like to pay my respects to any mob that are here tonight and say hello to you and thank you for coming along. This is the first event in a new series of seasonal creative salons presented in partnership with the Wheeler Centre and the State Library of Victoria. And so tonight is a celebration of NAIDOC. And so the best way to celebrate NAIDOC is to get one of our great guests up here this evening. And our first guest is Susie Anderson. And she writes from the nexus of compassion and resistance, which is what so many First Nations writers are doing these days. Her poetry and non-fiction are widely published online and in print, such as in Archer, Artist Profile, Artlink, Magazine, and growing up in Aboriginal in Australia, and in many poetry anthologies. In 2018, she was the runner-up for the Overland Poetry Prize and awarded the Emerging Writers Fellowship at the State Library of Victoria. In 2019, she was awarded the Writers Victoria Nilma Sydney Grant and is the recipient of the Overland Writers Residency. In 2020, she edited the online journal Tell Me What You Mean, Volume 4, for Australian Poetry. And in 2021, she has won the Black and Write Fellowship. Congratulations. The money hasn't arrived yet, so you have to buy your own drinks. Her professional practice is as a digital producer in the arts and creative industries, ranging from Sydney, London and Melbourne. 2 of those cities are out of bounds right now. Leveraging her position with institutions, she attempts to bring about change by uncovering and amplifying stories from her own and other communities. She's a descendant of the Wagaya people and the Wemba peoples of Western Victoria. She is here, she's living on Boonwurrung land, but she's here on Wurundjeri land right now. Please welcome Susie Anderson.
Thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. I also pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we're gathering here tonight, and also acknowledge that it's NAIDOC week, the theme is Heal Country, and I'm taking a deep breath to remember the land that I am on right now and how I can play my part in taking care of country. And some of the work that I'm going to read tonight is is, all of it is kind of linked to place and how we inhabit place and how we move through places and the things and stories that we might not always be aware of but are constantly present as we go through those places. This is called measurements. The shoreline was measured by year. The people were measured by blood. The distance was measured by time. The pain was measured by depth. But then again, so was all feeling and especially love. And the place was pulling me under. Everyone knows that Jacaranda means spring and comes in the warmth of late October. Purple plumage signalling and delighting until November, when rain turned the violet petals into brown. That air was tacky from January to about April, and I hated it. Sticky bricks caught your shoes. People dropped ice cream from one of the 12 local creameries. Perfumed by rubbish bins, picked over by ibis who have already scoured the overflow, all sickly somehow. Never-ending horn cycle of boats backing in and out of the ferry terminals. Crowds of white corn-road tourists lugging suitcases, looking lost, going slow and getting in the way, bringing gastro off the boats. I can feel the humidity even now, like a cloak I'm struggling to get out of. Let me go. A line crookedly loops sandstone to sails, the shoreline creeping forward as the harbour grew. Plaques of riders who visited or lived there joined dots between its boundary line. I came into port there 5 days a week, 5 years in a row. I jogged that water and rode my bike up to the white buildings, but didn't just become a runner there. The impressive self-conviction of the place deeply intoxicated me. Once a cab driver back home asked where I lived and he said, "Oh, that's the rat race." And he was right. You want to win and be a part of the race, even though the finish line keeps moving further and further away. 2 charity runs took me across landmarks I'd only seen on telly, one through the park and the other along the coat hanger. Daily life became a competition. You're always jostling with others and all trying to win first prize. The artist Gordon Bennett tracked cycles of removal at the harbour and didn't give it a title, but black people don't need it named because they lived it. Only 6 shades take the eye from dismay to dismiss, operating in the negative space. It's not black and white. Everything greying before its disappearance, or is it just absence of presence? Place may miss spirit. Maybe I realised how salt water is healing, and that is why I dived into the deep end so often. May spirit play miss. During a festival that put the harbour in plain view but cast more shadows, those shells were brighter and flashier than ever. Avoid creating an amnesia of light, ideas and music. Many feet hit the pavement. Crowds who don't even pause to know what they are ignoring, a mob mentality. What else came over me? Came over me. I said I would never write about you, and I'm not. This is about The Distance of Your Heart by Tracy Emin, an installation at Macquarie Place, 60 bronze birds and a water trough about the loneliness of a city. A small, ugly park with none of the charm of the other micro parks around the inner west, with an obelisk masking the distance between settlements. Where is the massacre site obelisk? Where is the line drawing memorial between battles? Survival milestones deserve plaques and place. This is about local people and stories that taught me warrior ways, of Barangaroo on the water and Maria Lock a little inland. I am humbled to know how and did and whether water connected us all. This is for the mob who held my hand when I didn't know how to step into my place, who keeps nothing of its people but holds everything about the past, a riddle of the same disappointment. Shoreline is never fixed, an ebb and an untetherable place. Never fixed, not like the problem of the Aborigines was meant to be. We cannot be worked out. Measure next to erasure creates the story, the everything else. I am all parts compassion, so I understand grey area. I am unfixed, unfixable, yet I never wanted to write about politics, and I'm not. This is about throwing my shoes overboard, no. About jumping into the sea, no. About hearing you say, no, no. About an ebb, an untetherable place, a flow. Southern waters are flat and calm, but all ports are the same. If it's shallow, you can still drown. Make no mistake, I am still throwing myself in. Thank you. I mean, we know where that was about. I hope. I did live in Sydney for 5 years, and it wasn't all bad. This is called Zodiac Buzzkiller. Celebrity Compatibility Astrology website. Of course, Jesus was actually a Pisces and actually a celebrity. Might be on the cusp of a major breakthrough regarding his proclivity for fish. Lots of celebrities Sagittarius. Would have thought more celebrities were Leos. Spotify shared the star signs of my most listened to artists. They were mostly Scorpios. What a genuine pleasure to know the astrology of someone who's singing to you. Kian, we'll do this later. An analysis of compatibility between colleagues through an app popular with queer-adjacent friends affirms everything already known to us. Another story of a manager who ran the workplace around everybody's star signs. Feeling so seen by Instagram astrologers, categorized by meme-based content. Feeling so millennial right now. Feeling so millennial inside this poem about astrology. So safe to be inside this poem in one of 12 categories. The Woolworths 1.25 litre soda water is a great deal. Of course you would love that deal, a Capricorn. A seamless segue from preferred beverage types of millennials into one for the literature lovers. 2 American poets take astrological aspects and summarise into 240 characters or less. Every writer loves a constraint. Everybody wants an interpretation. Interpret me. A small pig smiled upon the year 2019. Not a snake, I am a small dragon, luckier than most. This new level of enlightenment is thanks to a holiday to the east. This new level of commitment not only to the self, but also in sense. Rising sign helps explain the sun sign, but mother doesn't exactly remember the time of birth. Sorry for getting so philosophical. No, I like it. It's rare to meet someone who talks like this. Just one more. This is the poem that was the runner-up in the 2018 Overland Prize. It's called Revolve. I first noticed it in England, or perhaps it finally found me. I had assumed all this time I was being watched, and here was proof. Clear halo in deep navy, shining iris nightly, no stars. Second time, the orientation was more natural, immense. I walked to sky's edge where town stops, lay underneath stars low and heavy enough to reach, the bright, wanting more. All moon, all the time, the third time. Celestial ceremony captured in ochre, made it not 1, but 2, 3, 4 eyes that follow even by day. That old one walked the earth before there was moon, held a torch and created the day, never made it back to her son. What will we do if we lose that fire? Finally, we learned how it worked. Did we move or did the moon? Was it both? Anyway, we drove towards it that night. It was super, and the next one will be blue. Thank you.
Moving on to our second part of this evening, and I should probably introduce myself. My name is Daniel James. I host a show on Triple R called The Mission, which is on Tuesday nights. I do a bit of writing. I do some writing for Sean McCullough's Mad as Hell. I do a bit of work with Radio National. I'm a Yorta Yorta man. I'm a Gunai Kurnai man. Man about town. That's pretty much it. And I just find myself doing things like this from time to time, which is an honour, absolute honour. So let's go to our conversation for this evening, the conversation component of this evening. And our guest is Larissa Behrendt, who is a Yuwalluai Kamilaroi woman born in Cooma, New South Wales. What isn't she is probably easier to say than what she is. She's a lawyer, an academic, a writer, a broadcaster, a social justice advocate, and a filmmaker. But from my perspective, what she is most of all is constantly evolving. She is constantly evolving to better herself and ourselves to be able to meet the challenges of this cause that we call Aboriginal affairs and social justice. She's evolving in search of the most evocative ways to tell stories of First Nations people right across the place we now know as Australia. It has seen her transform from a legal professional to academic to one of the nation's most esteemed storytellers. The common thread in which each one of these evolutions has been brought is the stories of the oldest continuous culture known to the planet we live on. Excuse me. And she does that so broader society has an ability to appreciate the value that we as First Nations people bring, but also help the broader community understand the pain that our mob have endured over the last 230 years in particular. Lisa has written extensively on legal and Indigenous and social justice issues. Her books include Aboriginal Dispute Resolution way back in 1995, Achieving Social Justice in 2003, and she co-authored a book called Treaty back in 2005. Her work, she has 2 works of fiction, including a novel, Home, which won the Queensland Premier's Literary Awards, the David Unaipon Award in 2002, and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Novel in the Southeast Asian South Pacific region. She has three novels. Her second novel, Legacy, won the Victorian Premier's Literacy Award Prize for Indigenous Writing in 2010. In 2012, she published Indigenous Australians for Dummies, which I have a copy of myself. It's more useful than you know, let me tell you. Her story reminds us that it is through story that we can all connect. And with that connection, truth can foster and true history can be told. Larissa's latest novel, After Story, which will be available via readings at the end of this evening, is one such story that is used skillfully and deftly by Lisa to convey the reality of intergenerational trauma in all its nuances. Now, unfortunately, Larissa can't be here tonight, but she is broadcasting to us from Sydney, so if you want to make Larissa welcome, let's make her welcome. Larissa. First question off the rank, and it's a question that goes straight to our humanity. How are things for you up there in lockdown Sydney at the moment?
Well, thanks for asking, and it gives me a chance to acknowledge that I am on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm very sorry to not be with everyone there tonight in person. I've got a lot of friends and connections in Melbourne, so feeling the separation. And, you know, I think we're bracing for a long lockdown and, you know, I guess getting to feel a little bit of what you guys all went through last year. So thanks for asking, but I think we're bunkering down.
Yeah, no, if you ever need any tips, just hit us up. I guess probably the best tip I can give you is just buy lots of alcohol and drink lots of alcohol and just sleep through the day and, you know, just let the rest will just take care of itself. Don't worry about it.
All right, good advice.
Maybe that's just my life. We'll get to the book shortly, but while we have you, such an esteemed guest, it would be ridiculous if I didn't ask you about some other subject matters this evening. And while we're in NAIDOC, happy NAIDOC, by the way, Larissa.
Thank you very much.
But let's pick your brains about a number of things. But let's start with you and let's go to the beginning. the first threads of your activism really started for you when you were a teenager, and you realised there were a number of government policies used to designed to basically take people away from their culture, away from their families, away from their mothers. Is that where it started for you? Is that what has led you to where we are now?
Daniel, it is. It's, and of course, because of my family's personal experience with the removal policy, and even as a child, understanding that it had been cruel and devastating, and being very frustrated. I was going through a school system that didn't teach any Indigenous content. It's wonderful to have a NAIDOC celebration. It's wonderful to do acknowledgement of country, but as many people would realise and remember, this is a fairly recent thing. So for many of us, we grew up going through a school system that didn't do any of that, didn't do any celebration of our culture, downplayed it, tried to ignore it. And these really important things about our personal history weren't taught. So I was switched on to that at a very early age. I guess the other thing that was really instrumental, and I think as I look back now, I've carried with me, was not just that I understood in my heart that these things were wrong, but because I had the great privilege of growing up being exposed to the community in Redfern during that time, I got a really great education by hearing amazing people speak in a range of forums, everyday forums for the way that we lived, but people like Gary Foley, Chicka Dixon, Bobby Sykes. So I feel like that the exposure to that intellectual engagement with rights and politics, as I look back, really shaped my advocacy as well. When I look at the legal work I do, the policy work I do, even the framework around my storytelling, there's a lot that's about self-determination. And I think that was probably the other thing that helped me. I had the emotion of what I felt was wrong, but being exposed to that generation before me and their activism gave me a language and helped me find a voice.
Yeah, definitely. That generation of activists that you're referring to, their power and their passion and their energy in many ways was contagious, and it's still being felt. Their actions and their emotions are being felt today. All of that led you to studying law, and eventually you studying law at a place called Harvard Law School. I don't know whether you've heard of it. But when you actually started practicing law, and you started with legal aid, you realised fairly early on that you didn't want to be part of the churn of the legal system. You actually wanted to change the legal system. When did that realisation take place, and where did that lead you to?
Yeah, so great question. I did become a lawyer because I wanted to change the world, and was much inspired by characters like Atticus Finch as to what that looked like and sounded like. And I took a job at Legal Aid in family law, and as I know you're aware, I've continued to work around child protection for the whole of my career. But my main job was processing maintenance claims through the local court at Parramatta. So it didn't take long to realise this wasn't the law reform that I was looking at. But I guess it was a bigger thing for me too. I had the experience of going through university, and I think, as I mentioned, I grew up in a education system that didn't teach about Indigenous issues, and my brother and I were the only kids at our school who identified as being Indigenous. And I was really lucky to be part of that first cohort that went from high school to university because of that activism of the generation before me. And in that cohort, just in my year at university, was Anita Heiss, Terry Jenke. There are a whole range of really...
Whatever happened to them?
Yeah, I know, right? Sonia Stewart, Philippa McDermott, a really amazing cohort of women and men, but that I guess we're all on the crest of that. So finally kind of meeting people that were of the same generation, the same mindset, spoke the same language, had the same passion was was a revelation for me. And my brother and I actually did our first writing together when we were at university, writing for the university newspaper. And I remember our first article we ever wrote was about police corruption in Redfern, and it was called Rotten Apples or Bad Fruit ? But it was just that moment where I found that I could start to speak about the things around me. So it wasn't just that of finding myself in a job that wasn't what I was aspiring to do. It was actually taking a step back and realizing that I hadn't really critiqued the system as I should have. I accepted the proposition that if I became a lawyer and worked in that legal system, I would be an agent of change. And I think because of the situation I was in, it became very clear that that wasn't going to be the case. So I immediately was drawn back to academia, where I'd first had that chance to express my own voice and my own opinion, which is why I wanted to also do study. But it's led me to continue to work in a space like academia that I can use to really do that broader law reform. And I guess I'm lucky that it was a lesson that came quickly, because I could kind of then redirect my career very quickly to start to do things that felt more meaningful and more transformative.
So even after and let's not forget, Aboriginal people and Aboriginal girls in particular, back when you were studying law, was a very, very rare thing. So that's remarkable in itself. You got sick of Parramatta, fair enough. And so you went back into academia, but then you had another realisation while you were having a stellar career in academia. And, I've been cyber stalking you a lot the last week and a bit. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but that realisation that you had was, how are we actually going to change things more broadly here? You have the legal career, you have a stellar career in academia, you've looked at the system, you've got ideas about how to change the system, but one of the realisations you had was the way we can actually change things in this country is through story. And that story itself is a very, very powerful tool. Do you want to talk about that idea of story as a change agent?
Because it speaks to the fact, as your observation earlier, that I do see myself as continuing a kind of learning as I've gone along. And one of the most profound ones for me in terms of thinking about my own practice and how I spend my time and what I put my energy in has been really looking at the power of story and how to use it. And you're no stranger to that as a lawyer, because part of what you're trained to do is to take somebody's story and fit it into a framework to be able to advocate for them when they can't advocate for themselves, or you can help them navigate a system that's stacked against them, that speaks a language that not everyone's familiar with. And I guess there were a couple of things that I was really challenged with by the work I was doing more generally. I mean, I think it's the case that a lot of people working in the Indigenous space are constantly frustrated by the fact that we do really strong evidence-based work. We have really clear ideas of what works. We see enormous opportunities and examples, persuasive examples in our own communities, led by people who really understand how things work in those communities, namely our own people and our own community organisations. And yet there's very little ability to change policy and government ideology by using facts and evidence base, even though that's what they say they do. So, with the team that I work with at UTS, there are some amazing people that work there with me, like Alison Whitaker and Lyndon Coombs, so all people who have been really fantastic agents of change. We do a lot of that kind of law reform work where we either are running cases, we run a legal practice through the university as well, a clinic. So we're trying to do changes by doing strategic litigation. We do submissions. We put in reports to parliamentary inquiries. We do commissioned research. And I have to say, I think that provides really good work and it gives people tools to use around advocacy. But you never see that being taken up. And we only have to look at how how persuasive, research-driven and complete the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and the Bringing Them Home report were, to know we have 2 blueprints you could implement immediately to make important structural change and really make important outcomes there that have been completely neglected. And we sit through other Royal Commissions, the Northern Territory Royal Commission recently into child protection and detention. Same results, same recommendations. My team works with a number of Aboriginal families who are either been victims of crime or in a similar vein have had the experience of having a loved one die in custody. Those coronial inquests often come up with exactly the same recommendations as you see in those 2 reports. So there's a level of frustration that we feel in terms of knowing that we're speaking truths and providing evidence, but there's no cut through. And I guess one of the things that I'm really kind of grateful for learning through my advocacy in more recent years is starting to understand the power of being able to create space for people who have been subjected to something really unjust, and how powerful their voices are if you can find an audience for them. That it's much more powerful to hear their stories than it is to hear the stories of their advocates. So, for example, the first feature film that I did was on the Barriville murders in New South Wales, where I've been working with the 3 families of the murdered Aboriginal children. And I guess they were the first people who taught me to think about the power of that. Their ability to tell that story not only helped raise awareness of their plight, but was used as really crucial evidence and was very influential in the New South Wales parliamentary inquiry. It didn't lead to the legal outcome we were working for, but it led to a raft of other changes that provided support for the family, recognition of what they'd gone through, reform in policing, education, a whole range of things that the families also wanted to achieve to make sure what happened to them didn't happen to other people. And I guess just secondly, it's also become really apparent to me in relation to the 2 issues that my team probably work with the most are deaths in custody and child removal. And not surprisingly, given what an influence and how much contact our people have with both of those systems. And I think one of the challenges around the increasing rates of Aboriginal child removal is that there is still a complacency around that issue in terms of people just assuming that if child protection is involved, there must be a reason. And you have to work in the area to know how often it happens that they get involved when there is no reason for them to get involved. The number of wrongful removals we deal with. And it is very hard to impress upon people how egregious these situations are. And we found that actually providing a platform for mothers and grandmothers particularly, and a platform to tell the story of parents, was actually a much more persuasive way to get a broader audience engaged with what is unjust about this issue that doesn't come out when you just hear the statistics. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to find out more about this issue to have a look at the Family Matters campaign, which is run by our community controlled organisations. And the film that we made with the Grandmothers Against Removal and working in conjunction with those organisations, particularly with VACA. So there's quite a few of the really hard workers in the sector there in Victoria in the film. In After the Apology, which is available on SBS On Demand. But you can see in that film how being able to create the space where people told those stories creates a much more powerful way to help us understand the injustices of what is happening in that system, to really provoke us to think about how we change it. And, one of the reasons why people in that situation have so little ability to talk about when something really egregious and wrong has happened to them is the law prohibits them from speaking out in relation to anything that has a care order in place. So journalists are really prohibited from telling these stories that we all know about. So we used animation as a way to mask the identities, but allow women to tell their stories in their own voice. So I really encourage people to have a look at, how we've been able to really try and think about storytelling and allowing people to tell their stories as a way of really providing insight and provoking change.
That Family Matters is a wonderful organisation. It's there primarily to look after the interests of Aboriginal women and children who are, in terms of the way people are treated through the various systems we have, the child protection systems, the justice systems, the incarceration systems we have, to put it bluntly, the lowest of the low. And so organisations like Family Matters, we can go to familymatters.org.au, do tremendous work in advocating for those particular cohorts. You mentioned the Royal Commissions, Larissa, and we have people that go into those Royal Commissions. We have family members that go into coronial inquests that pour their heart out, and their stories are so vivid and so heartbreaking that by themselves they should be enough to paint a picture for people to clutch onto. Where do those processes fail in terms of being able to cut through to the broader population?
I think it's the length of the process, the lack of voice a family has in that process. There are so few opportunities for them to put their perspective and their view forward. So they're really excluded. We don't give a lot of support for victims of crime going through the system. We give even less to families going through the coronial system. It is a very, very difficult place. And when you think, the coronial inquest will look at the circumstances around a death. Often it's the first time a family will see graphic CCTV footage of an actual death. The re-traumatisation of people going through that process is something really shocking. And I'm glad you brought it up, because for me as an advocate, it's been one of the hardest things. In fact, some of the threads of the story in After Story come from working with victims of crime and that powerlessness within the system. And there's a callousness and there is a real racial bias in there. I mean, one of the things that, that was a real driver of me writing After Story was the experience of working with Aboriginal victims of crime and hearing white people in places of high authority within the legal system basically say to them they should move on. They should start, getting over it and moving on. And it struck me when I heard a very senior member of the legal profession say that to an Aboriginal father whose child had been murdered, that he would never have said that to a white father. He would never have told him, you'll get over it, just move on. There was just a level in which the whole narrative around assuming that Aboriginal parents don't care about their children is still really pervasive. I see it in child protection. And if we're looking at stories, I'd just also on ABC iView recommend people look at another film that I was involved with producing called In My Blood It Runs, which tells the story of a young boy, Aboriginal boy in Alice Springs, completely through his own worldview, which is a view you never see. You rarely hear that voice. It's a very powerful heartfelt story, but one that's also full of resilience and the caring of the Aboriginal family. It's a wonderful film. But in making that film and talking to the family about what they wanted to get out of the film coming out, one of the first things they said was, we want people to know we love our children. And my heart almost broke that should be such a radical idea. But from working in child protection and seeing these attitudes in the criminal justice system, I could understand exactly why that would be something that they thought was a message that they wanted to tell broader Australia.
One of the most, if you haven't seen in My Blood It Runs, I thoroughly recommend it. I forget the name of the young fella in that, Larissa. What was his name?
Joanne.
Yeah, Joanne. He was a bright, extremely intelligent, charismatic kid who, on paper, should have everything going for him. But what in My Blood It Runs actually highlights is that even though this kid is extremely talented and extremely smart, he is just, because he's living in a remote community and he's Aboriginal, he's that far away from coming in contact with the various systems that we've been speaking about this evening. And it just goes to show and make you ponder the question, is it the kid or is it the system that is the problem here? And this is what Larissa, of course, is dedicating her life to. Let's get to the book. One of the things that I've always thought as an advocate of sorts myself, Larissa, is that one of the breakthroughs we can get here in terms of cutting through and getting people to understand where we're at as Aboriginal people in this country and why we face so many obstacles in the society that's been built around us, certainly not for us, is the idea of intergenerational trauma. And I feel that if we can get that as an understood concept and understand the impacts that it has on generations of Aboriginal people throughout the years and how one event 150 years ago can continue to have an impact on mob today, that if we can get that story out there and happening, people will understand why things are the way they are, and then they'll be able to actually do something about it. Now, with After Story, you have attempted successfully to be part of that conversation and to basically, through the narrative process of After Story, talk about intergenerational trauma in a very nuanced way through the two main characters, Brittany and Delma. Where did the story originate, and what made you think about telling that story through the prism of the classics and a tour of the UK? That is just genius.
Yeah, I surprised a few people when they realised I've set my characters on a literary tour of England, but I will get to why that was chosen. But the seed of the story, which is a mother-daughter story, looks at the relationship between Della and her daughter who is university educated and kind of as a child escaped into those classics. But you know, within the family, decades before, there was a murder of one of Della's other daughters, Brittany, and Jasmine, the surviving daughter, then has to, I guess, navigate that. And, you know, working with victims of crime over a long period of time, I got to see how that generational trauma gets transmitted in a very real way. The exhaustion of parents advocating for justice for a child is consuming. Their grief is consuming. Their guilt, which they obviously bear none of but carry, of what's happened, is very real. And it is another thing that is pushed on those families. And I was very interested in looking at that dynamic between the mother and daughter. And I chose the literary tour around the sites of England and looking at the classics. It reflects my own upbringing. I, you know, unfortunately grew up in a time when we didn't have the books of, you know, Alexis Wright and Tony Birch and Anita Heiss and Melissa Lukashenko, and it was hard to
Larissa
find
Behrendt.
Indigenous stories. But I did really love those books. I learned a lot about the plight of women from Austen and Bronte. They talk about women being oppressed within a system, and I understood what they were saying. They helped me understand that part of the world, how your ambitions and your expectations of what you want to be can be crushed and restrained by the world you live in and the decision that is made by others that you have no part in. I was very influenced by Dickens and learnt about class system. I mean, there's a lot that, even going back and rereading all of these books as part of the writing of this book, helped me realise how resonant they still were. I didn't include Orwell so much in the tour, but he was also a very big, my father would always get me to read George Orwell. So, you know, I learned a lot
Orwell
about...
was say 2020.
Yeah, it was. And Virginia Woolf, who I went back and read as this, it's kind of interesting and shocking how relevant and resonant some of her work still is today. So, you know, people of the colonial structure, I still could find these books. And so part of the literary journey was it was a narrative device for me. I had been not on this tour. I had to make this tour up. I did the research by going to these places, but I'd been on those kind of tours with my mother, and I knew how claustrophobic they were. So I thought it was such a great way to put two characters in a situation together where they couldn't really escape each other and really have to deal with the issues that are between them. But I guess that decision about the literary tour as well was also about being able to compare in a way where I revere both traditions. The similarities and tensions and comparisons between that literary history and the oral history, the storytelling of our 65,000 year plus tradition of storytelling. And one of the things I really wanted to explore in the book, and I choose two cultural stories in there, is to try to show people how layered those stories are. They were often, as Dreamtime stories, used to illustrate children's books as though, they are little parables, and there's always a little moral to them. But those stories contain so much more information. They tell you about how the landscape was formed. They actually there are ways in which those cultural stories link back to actual geological shifts in the environment. There are ways in which they tell you how to live with country. They do teach you lessons. So, in a book where there's a lot of thematics about how we treat children, which comes out in Dickens as much as it comes out in the legal system we look at in Australia. I chose a story where that was really the heart of it, is the punishments you get if you don't look after children. But there was so much more knowledge in that story. So for me, it was a way of also trying to through story, engross a reader more in thinking about those knowledge systems from our culture. And I think people often easily think about what our cultures tell them now about sustainability and living with country, but they also have a lot to say with how we live with each other and how we treat with each other and how we're a community. And that is another element that I think we need to explore more.
The book is full of juxtaposition. So it's looking at European knowledge, particularly British literature, which of course has traditionally been taught in Australian schools, and thankfully that's beginning to change. They should still be taught, of course, but we need to hear First Nation stories as well, of course. It compares that sort of knowledge, like you were just saying, with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems. What did you want the reader to take away from that comparison? I mean, what was it that you want people to walk away with when they think about that knowledge system compared to that knowledge system and where we as Australians fit?
Yeah, and look, I think as a First Nations writer, you always know you're writing for two audiences. And I guess for me, what was important was to try through story to write about the things that I feel we experience that often, we respond to when we see in story because it speaks to our own experience. So I wanted to do that. And for me, when I talk about those knowledge systems, I know it starts to trigger in other First Nations people their memory and their understanding of their own stories and their own knowledge systems. And there's sort of a process in the book where, one of the ways in which Della and Jasmine, seek to repair their relationship is coming together back through the stories of their culture. So story plays a real healing process for us as well. But I guess at the heart of it too, it was also an acknowledgement of how much knowledge sits in those elders. They both remember an elder who was passed by the time they take the literary tour, but whose stories they heard and always enjoyed, but never thought to write them down and collect them or exchange them or talk to each other about them. And I guess in a way it was also, celebrating all of that knowledge we have, and it sits there right amongst us, but being a bit of a caution about the need to make sure we capture it. For a non-Indigenous audience, I think my aim was slightly different, which was to, I guess, open up to show them through the way that we understand and talk about our stories and our history and our knowledge systems, to show that there's more to them than perhaps they realise, so that they might be curious enough to find out a little bit more about them.
The story basically is told by the mother and daughter relationship of Della and Jasmine. Both of those voices reading the book resonate very strongly with me as an Indigenous person, as I'm sure you would appreciate. How did those characters evolve over time while you were writing? Because I know Della, I know her, and I know Jasmine, right? And I know these people. Their voices become closer and closer and closer as the book goes on. How did you develop those characters in your mind, and did you base them on anyone? If you say Jasmine's based on you, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Obviously very influenced by my own experience, because I am of her experience in that way. But I actually had a stronger connection and respect to my own culture than I think that she engaged with when she was, she spends a lot of time trying to fit in with white culture, and I never had that. I feel very privileged when I look back on my life that both of my parents were very quick to instill in me a pride in my culture. By the time I walked into a schoolyard, I was very proud of who I was, and no one could make me feel ashamed of it. And even achieving within a white system, I never felt like I had to downplay that or be ashamed of it or try and hide it in any way. So to that extent, I think I was more liberated than Jasmine, but I see her in other people, and she is closer to me. Obviously, her thoughts about the books and authors are things that I think and feel, and I wanted to share and give insight to. But I found her harder to write and harder to like. But Della, I fell in love with immediately. And perhaps because, like you, I knew Della in various personas, and she was an amalgam of women who have been, incredibly important and instrumental to me. And I can hear their voices in my head. So her voice came very easily to me. And I guess I've sort of studied her for a long time without realizing, Daniel, one of the things the kind of things our elders say that I think has been a really important lesson for me, and I'm glad I learned it early, was that real wisdom comes from listening, not speaking. And it meant that I never felt, I know, when I'm with you, Mob, I'm fairly outspoken, but I'm actually quite shy when I don't know people. So I do that black fella thing of not saying much and just probably intimidating people when
You're amongst friends this evening, so just continue on.
That's right. So, I tend to be fairly quiet and I look and listen, but my parents were also very good at making sure that I spent a lot of time with older Aboriginal women when I was growing up. And I listened to them and I learned. So a lot of Della's wisdom, her very down to earth, tell it like it is, no airs and graces, but get to the heart. And there's real wisdom in that. Were people that I knew. And I would say that the matriarch who we've discussed, Auntie Elaine, was also based on a couple of real women who held that role of being real elders and real spiritual knowledge holders who I've had the privilege of knowing who've passed. And their passing gave me a grief I could barely comprehend. And in a way, writing After Story was driven by the stories you and I discussed about the legal system and what we've both seen being advocates around that space of deaths in custody and victims of crime. But it was also a process of getting through that grief of losing a couple of really significant older women who had that role.
I mean, you just mentioned that Della's voice, the mother's voice, is a very down-to-earth, very straight voice, but it's a voice that resonates with me so strongly because I've known generations of Aboriginal women, probably of that generation, where they don't say much, but they say it very directly, and if you're listening to it, you know that there's so much more there under the surface, and it's up to you to listen and try and find out what that knowledge is. The character that's probably the biggest character in the book but doesn't actually have a narrative voice is Auntie Elaine. And again, I know Auntie Elaine. How did you come up with her presence as a narrative device for the book?
Oh, look, I guess it was that thing of feeling finding it very hard to articulate the grief I felt at losing them and how much knowledge we lose. And I felt, in a way, there had to be a balance in the storytelling of, how her interaction with both Jasmine and Della was a way for those two to find a way back in their relationship. That she is, as you know, those women in our community are the glue, they're the peacemakers, they're the fixers. They're often the people who will, make you feel most ashamed if you do the wrong thing. So to that extent, they're the highest court of you staying on the right path. And in a way, I guess what I wanted to highlight was how our memory of the knowledge and our engagement with our elders is a part of our storytelling tradition that weaves us back together. And I guess it comes back to some of your earlier questions about storytelling and its role. We can understand how stories are healing for people who've been, we spoke earlier about the need to give voice to people who've been victims of something terrible so that their story's heard. But there are also other ways that storytelling becomes a really important part of strengthening the fabric of our community. That's why we told them as cultural stories. They kept us together as a community. And there's a lot of our cultural practices, and I think of possum cloak making as one of these, where they're done communal, because the process of making the coat and telling the stories as you make the coat, particularly about the person who you're making the coat for, and particularly telling younger people in the family about the older person, is actually part of our inherent knowledge of how we keep our social fabric strong. So there's a way in which storytelling is healing in an individual sense, but it's healing in a communal sense. And I was really interested to highlight how these elders in our community who are in those positions like Auntie Elaine play these many different roles in terms of what they teach us about how to live.
One of the moments in the book that stood out for me, I think one of the tour guides or something was saying, there isn't anyone in Western culture that is like Shakespeare, or it would have been Dickens or something. And then I think it was Della that said to herself, well, no other culture has Auntie Elaine.
That's right.
And
yes, the literature
that is so
professor,
true.
she puts him in his place all
That's
the time.
Right. Look, we're slowly but surely running out of time here. I can't recommend the book enough. It's a nuanced exploration of relationships of broader society and where we all sit within it. While we still have you, Larissa, it's NAIDOC week, and NAIDOC week for Mob is often a time to reflect, and sometimes people are run off their feet as well. But for those of us that actually have the opportunity to reflect, and you have the opportunity to reflect now, given where you are, how do you think we're tracking? Do you think that we're making progress? Do you think we're getting to where we need to go in terms of social justice? Obviously still have a way to go, but when you compare this NAIDOC week and where we are now compared to, say, NAIDOC week 10 years ago, are we making progress, or are we stagnant, or are we slipping back?
I have a qualified answer on that. I think it's, that acknowledgement of country is such a common ceremony and protocol now that so many people celebrate NAIDOC week, and more and more people are interested in Indigenous stories. More people engaging with Indigenous media and should listen to your show if they want to have a little bit more of that. Are engaging with Indigenous writing. It's not just a great time for Indigenous writing, it's a great time for visual storytelling with the sort of work being done by Warwick Thornton and Dylan River and, Blackfella Films. We've got amazing filmmakers as well. More Australians are engaging with that. And I think there is a deeper interest now, I really feel it, in genuinely engaging with Aboriginal cultures and thinking about the knowledge systems. I think particularly past the summer of the horrendous bushfires, people are starting to ask more deep questions about what these cultures that live sustainably on this country for 65,000 years have to tell us. I love the theme this year about Heal Country because it kind of challenges us to be proactive about our relationship with country. And my hope is always that people, if they're with their engagements during these moments like NAIDOC, carry them on for the rest of the year, that they don't just tick the box. And I think more and more people do that. You can see it in a range of ways. But where I do feel, and I would say the other thing that I think is amazing is that we see a younger generation of people coming through who are phenomenal. The number of younger researchers, the poets, the writers, yes, we've just had a very great example with Susie, whose words were healing and provocative and wonderful. We are really blessed with the generations coming through, and that always gives me great hope. One day you and I will be able to retire, Daniel, because of these great people coming through.
All right. I don't know what your fee is, but I will be able to after tonight. So that's fantastic.
Well, good on you. Your agent's better than my agent. But I guess for me, what also is an issue is I see the number of deaths in custody continue to climb. Increasing incarceration rates, particularly for our young people. They're also bad for our women and our men, but for our juvenile population, they're horrendous. We see the increasing of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care and a decrease in the number of those children placed within Aboriginal carers. Those things continue to worry me. There are structural problems with our system. We cannot fix the system without dealing with those structural problems, and there is no ability to that. I feel comforted by the strong voices we've got and the fact that we're having conversations we've not had before. But I hope it transforms into actual systemic and institutional change. And I'm very aware of how many people feel frightened and threatened by those conversations, and whether it's around our issues as First Nations people, in particular our issues with our children and women. But also we see the same thing in the way as soon as issues around gender get raised in any context, the backlash and vitriol around it is frightening, aggressive and violent. And that I think is something that we need to be diligent about and continue to work on. So hopefully we'll find a way by sharing our stories.
Stories is where it's at, and we thank you so much for your story. After Story, available with Reading's bookseller just over there. Thank you so much for your work. There's so much more I could talk to you about. Briefly, in 10 seconds, can you relive the NAIDOC versus Bolt case for us before we let you go? No? Okay, fair enough.
I won. That's it.
You won. All right. You're a winner. Thank you very much. Please thank Larissa Behrendt.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Our thanks to State Library of Victoria and to the Wheeler Centre, and my thanks to you, and of course my thanks to Kian, Susie and Larissa. Thank you very much.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.